Are we live?
We are. Hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour.
Yeah, please.
I'm Caitlin Miller, and this is Brandon Tessers.
Hello.
And this is not therapy for so many reasons.
We are in a different setup than usual because I'm getting older and I hurt my back playing with my children over the weekend. And in adjusting things, I somehow messed up the camera
The
too.
aspect ratio or whatever.
So now we're just going with it.
Yeah.
We don't have time to figure it out right
Yeah.
now.
So this is an open conversation, and Brandon takes over. Hello.
Oh, hello. Yes, this is not therapy. It is just an open conversation with the two of us about whatever we're talking about. And by we, I mean the two of us and those of you who are here. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate people who put. Sorry, it's going to weird me out because the aspect ratio of I messed it all up, and so I look so unusual in strange ways. And it's going to call my attention.
You look much different. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if part of it is because my chair is so much bigger than yours and that you're farther away from the camera than you normally are.
We'll try and figure it out and fix it for next week. But I'm going to get distracted by specifically the size of my hands on there. It's unusual in some way to me.
That is so funny. No, I know. Yeah, your proportions of your body look different, and mine too. I just try to not look at myself. Yeah.
So those of you who are here, if you're talking in the chat, then you're part of the conversation. You impact us and where we go. And yes, this can be a bit of a question and answer
an
type thing, but it doesn't have to be that. It's just this is when we're here and available, and we're all talking to one another. We work at a private therapy practice and coaching practice called Effective Artistry, located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual couples and family therapy, and will in the future and have in the past do groups, but are not currently running any groups. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches. Maria Moran, who has been a part of this stream in the past, but will not be here today, is one of our executive functioning coaches. Our therapists can work with people only in the state of Illinois. The coaches can work with people anywhere in the world. This is public. That's one of the many reasons that it's not therapy. So just be aware that if you are commenting, that those comments will appear publicly under your whatever account you're in. If you're watching this via Facebook, it's under your Facebook account. If you're watching this via Twitch, it's under your Twitch account, and YouTube, it's under your YouTube account, which is your Google account.
It also gets saved and republished. So
yes, these videos after this is live right now, but it will remain on YouTube as a video on demand for, I don't know, until
ever
YouTube does something differently than it's currently doing, I suppose.
Until YouTube is called MeTube, and we just download it all and go to a different website.
Yeah. Anyway, we're here. I think that's it. I think that's the important, part of it is that this chair is so much higher.
Yeah, there's a lot of things different.
So I'm way above you, so I had to adjust the camera angle differently to fit myself in.
Yeah.
These chairs that we normally sit in, I love. They're so comfortable. And right now, my back is doing better with a chair that
stiffer.
I don't sink into as much.
Yeah.
Where I can sit more upright.
It does better for my back too. I just don't do it.
Well, it's acute right now. I'm sure when it's not acute, I will not continue to do it. The back pain. Mm-hmm. Anyway, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah. I haven't seen you since Friday. How are you doing?
I'm a little disappointed because I rested a lot this weekend and I don't feel restful today, and I had a little bit of the Monday dread of I have a job and I don't know. And I don't feel that super often because I love this place so much. So I was that's kind of sad.
Well, I mean,
sometimes I think the first couple sessions on Mondays, I'm oh wait, I'm a therapist. And I'll be a therapist for the next 5 days. I don't know if you experience that ever, a different, it's not like I'm not myself, but it's just I feel like it's a different mode of communication. I like listen more than I do in my private life.
Well,
It takes a little bit more cognitive effort. I don't know.
I mean,
And I love it, but
there's
Yeah.
different. So Andy Mahoney, who I work for and you work for, that's where we met.
Mhm.
His work centers a lot around identity and identity as a tool, and I think this kind of thing that's a helpful way to think about that stuff. That
Mhm.
yes, we are all different. Caitlin the therapist is a different identity than Caitlin the friend, which is a different identity than Caitlin the daughter, and whatever, right?
Mhm.
And they're different, and switching between them, there are times where one is easier to be in. What he would always talk about is identity is a tool. Each identity is a tool that we use in order to interact with our environment and other people around us. And as with anything else, there are times where like using a tool, even though it's useful, is more difficult, where using a different tool, even though it's not suited to the task, would be easier. But
Could you describe the minutia of the tool of the identity of being a therapist?
minutia of you mean like what is
More
it about being a
details?
therapist?
Yeah.
What is involved in the identity of being a therapist?
Yeah, I'm curious, like, because I think I immediately go into like psychological analysis, but are you just talking about like the literally
Everything.
I bill insurance or whatever? Or I sit
No.
and I say, hi, I'm your therapist?
Well, the second one, sure.
Which
yeah.
honestly, sometimes I do to like warm up. I'm like, okay, I'm a therapist, hello.
Identity, like people talk about, especially these days, talk about gender identity a lot.
Mhm.
That's a place where identity gets used. Identity is about you and how you are being observed, interacted with, how you're presenting yourself, right? So
Is it more about how others view you than how you view yourself as identity?
you could say that. I don't know what Andy. I think what Andy would have said, and I do try to make sure to I think his work on identity is really good. I try to make sure to give credit where it's due. But I think Andy would, and I could be getting this wrong, I think he would say that identity is, through this lens, it's about you. It is about being particular, in the way that you are perceived and impacted by other people and impact other people and etc. But it's your identity. You are the one who's thinking of it as, this is who I am right now. You are the one who is saying what you're saying, dressing how you're dressing, using the mannerisms that you're using. There's a term, the term code switching,
Mm-hmm.
that I think is relevant to this, that like you speak differently to different people. You use different language in different scenarios, there are people who, when they talk to their parents, their accent becomes more strong. And then when they're talking to anyone else, it goes away, right?
Mm-hmm.
You use slang terms with friends that you don't use with colleagues and vice versa and whatever. So identity is about what you are doing. The idea, the intent, the purpose of it is to attempt to be precise in the way that other people perceive you, interpret you, are impacted.
And are other people's perceptions of you dictated by language and appearance?
Impacted by, but not
Impacted?
dictated by, yeah. Like what you say and how you look certainly impacts how people perceive you.
And I'm including like body language and touch.
Well, yeah. I mean, the things about you, some of which are things that you have more influence or ability to change and control, some of which are things that you can't. That's one part of what another person is taking in that influences how they're perceiving and feeling and behaving and whatever. But there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with you that impacts how people perceive you, right? Like language is a common thing. We talk about language all the time, right? That you didn't teach other people that you're speaking English to. You didn't teach them English. You didn't teach them what the word means. So whatever word you're using gets interpreted through things that you have no idea about. What you're saying gets interpreted, and therefore the impact that it has on people is impacted by other things that happened with other people that have nothing to do with you.
I think I might be really stuck on an immutable self.
What do you mean by that?
That there is some version of me that's theoretically authentic and the same and does not change within different interactions, and that the environment of the interactions is what influences people's perception of me, but that there is some sort of solid state.
People get stuck on that a lot, and
Yeah.
and you can talk about it in terms that make it so that it's not definitive whether that's the case or not, right? Like, part of what you're talking about is what a lot of people would say about a soul or a spirit or an essence or whatever, the me that is the me. But what is undeniable is that no matter whatever is happening on that, like, everyone speaks and behaves differently. What's happening on the inside, who knows? Everyone's different, and we don't know what's happening inside anybody else. We can only get our guesses and whatever through how people speak and behave, right? What they tell us. But it's observable, demonstrable that people speak differently to different people, behave differently in different contexts. And this is a problem that I see people, like clients, talk about all the time is, I don't want to be fake, I want to be real. Actually, I happen to remember that my way of talking about identity, like through this lens, my little metaphor is like the first thing that you mentioned hearing me say that made you like interested in working with me.
Mm-hmm.
That the way I think of it is what someone is calling like their immutable self or real self or whatever. It's like white light. And then identity is various different like lenses and prisms that in my identity as a father, I'm not doing anything or saying anything or feeling anything that isn't a part of who I am. But there are many things that are a part of who I am that I'm not doing in my identity as a father, in my identity as a streaming therapist. There's nothing I'm doing or saying or feeling or whatever that isn't a part of who I am, but there's many things that are a part of who I am that I'm not doing here. So I say this specific phrase that I'm going to knowingly, badly quote the Beatles. Not quote, but I'm blanking on the word that I usually use. Paraphrase. That there's nothing you can do that you can't do. There's nothing you can say that you can't say. There is no such thing to me as being fake in the sense of like it doesn't match up with who you are at your core. It can be useful for people to use that language in order to describe things where you're overriding a default impulse or consciously and knowingly making statements that you don't believe to be accurate about yourself or pretending to like something that you don't actually like and stuff like that. But there's no version of fake that means I am being somebody that I am not. It's still you. You're doing those things and saying those things, and you're doing and saying them for whatever reasons you are. It can be more taxing, it can be less pleasant, it can be more authentic, meaning more that you're accurately as you are able relaying your actual experience, or inauthentic or whatever. But it's all you.
Do you think some people utilize the paradigm of unmasking as... I'm stuck in the future.
I don't know what that means, but
I'm anticipating a social interaction I might have later today, and of course my brain is going to like the most dramatic negative possible outcomes of it, and then I'm getting stuck in the feeling as though it's real. So I'm trying to track you and listen to you, and then if
I tell you a story, will that be something that you can hear right now? It's real. I'm telling it because I think it's relevant and helpful to what you're describing. But if it's not something that,
sure, yeah.
I don't know if this is a true story or not, but that there was an engineer, a person driving a train, like a freight train, that came around a blind curve. There's a part of the tracks that turns and there's a big mountain in the way, and so you can't see very far ahead around the curve until you get there. And he came around, the train came around the curve, and he saw that up ahead there was another train that had derailed across the tracks. And he immediately accelerated his train as much as he possibly could and tucked himself into a little nook in the, engineer's compartment or whatever, the engine, I guess, the front train. And the train picked up enough speed that when it hit the derailed train, it knocked that one off of the tracks without derailing itself, and then continued on through. And when these things happen, they do a lot of investigating after the fact to see what went wrong and what went right and whatever. And when the people who were investigating it looked into it and did all the calculations, they came to the conclusion that in order for that to work, he had to accelerate the maximum amount possible within like a few milliseconds of seeing that train up ahead. That if he had accelerated any slower than that or started the process any later than that, then the accident would have been much worse than otherwise. It wouldn't have picked up enough speed to knock the other one off. It just would have been a worse collision. And if he had slowed down, he wouldn't have been able to brake in time to avoid it, but going slower would have made it, better than going faster until that threshold was reached. And so they all asked him, as part of the process, they interviewed him afterwards and said, how did you think so quickly to realize that, like, that's what you needed to do, accelerate, because it's counterintuitive, and you did it right away? And he said, I didn't think of it so quickly. I go around that curve hundreds of times a year, and every single time I do, I think, what if there was a train derailed up ahead? What would I do? What if the tracks were out ahead? What would I do? So he's been thinking about it forever, which is what enabled him that when the worst did happen, hundreds of times a year, and it's fine. And he's thinking about what terrible things could happen when they don't. And then one time a terrible thing does happen, and all of that pays off. So when you're projecting into a future interaction and you're thinking about how it could go terribly, that doesn't, of course, mean that it will go terribly, but it also doesn't mean that you are doing something irrational in worrying about it. You're considering the worst case scenarios. You're considering the possibilities that things go differently than you would want them to, as a way to be able to prepare to make it so that you make it as least likely as possible that it goes that way, or that if it does go that way, that you are as prepared as possible to make it, to ameliorate the problem as much as possible. Fear, anxiety, worry, these things, I think people get stuck in the idea sometimes between two options, that either the thing I'm worried about is likely to happen, or the thing I'm worried about is not likely to happen, or I think it isn't happening, or even might be impossible, and therefore there's something wrong with me for worrying about it. But that's not the point of fear and anxiety and worry. The point is, if you think about some bad potential outcome, that's how you prepare for that eventuality. That's how you learn and think about all the things that you can do to make it so that doesn't happen. The more worried you are about something, the less likely it is that it will happen, as long as there's any element of anything you can influence that plays into that, right? Like some things, will the Earth get hit by a meteor? Your worry about that has nothing to do with anything. But will this person be upset with me? Well, depending on how you speak and what you say and whatever, that impacts that. Mm-hmm. So the more worried you are about something, the less likely it is. That's not irrational. You don't need to call yourself dramatic.
I just imagined what I'm trying to explain, if I was the person driving the train, is that the hundreds of times I'd go around that curve, I would be so terrified of an accident that I'd prepare for it. But before the accident would have happened, I would have died of a heart attack because of all of the stress.
Right. You said when you were describing it initially, you said that you're thinking about it and then you get stuck in feeling like it's actually happening. And yes, that part is not helpful. Yeah. To be aware of the fact that... If it felt
like planning for a basketball game or something.
Like planning for a possibility that you're trying to avoid, and a possibility that if it was to happen, being prepared for it is better than not. That's great. But yes, then getting confused into thinking that that means that it will happen. That's what I was trying to say with the two possibilities, right? That sometimes you worry about a thing and your response to it is like, oh, that thing I'm worried about is going to happen or is happening. And now I'm feeling the way that I would feel if it was real. And sometimes you think, no, I'm being irrational for worrying about that thing. My response to this worry is irrational and disproportionate. And what's wrong with me? Why am I being so dramatic? And I think that's the point, is that neither of those is the case. It is completely rational to worry about something that isn't likely to happen. Doesn't mean that it will, so you don't need to feel that it is.
How do you change the feeling in your body that it is going to happen?
Well, when you're feeling it, that's where like mindfulness and call it distraction, whatever, like getting your attention onto something else.
Like hearing a story about a tree?
Yeah, or just engaging in a conversation at all. Whenever what you're experiencing internally is the source of distress itself, then you can always, theoretically at least, diminish your experience of distress by drawing your attention elsewhere. Stimming is a version of that, right? Like pretty much anything we would call regulatory behaviors, breathing exercises, or just doing something you enjoy, playing a video game, playing music, like doing anything which draws your attention away from what's happening in there diminishes that. The danger in that, and the reason that we sometimes have a hard time drawing our attention away, is because sometimes we'll think, well, no, I should be paying attention to this thing, and if I get myself to pay attention to something else, then I might miss stuff and things might go badly. But generally, no, there's not. When you're feeling that, like you're afraid of something and you start to feel like it's like how you would feel if it were actually happening, there's not like some thoughts that you can think that will change that in that moment. You just have to get your attention on something else. And then when it's not happening, there are things you can do, like what we're doing right now, that can change things so that theoretically it's less likely to happen or less intense when it does. Which is kind of the point of like everything that you want to change, like anything that a person wants to change, the moment when it is happening is not a moment that you can really do much to change it other than to just get through it, survive it, move on to the next thing as best you can. It's when it's not happening that you can do things that make it so that it's less likely to happen or that it's not as bad when it does. Again, that's the point of fear. That's the point of the story, is when you come around the curve and the train's there is not the time that you can figure out what to do. You can figure out what to do before it happens. Another way of saying this is, if I have a fear of heights, right? Like if I'm standing near a cliff and I am afraid of falling off of that cliff, that's beneficial, right? Because it keeps me away from that cliff, therefore making it less likely that I fall. If I'm being vigilant and other people are like, oh, you can get closer than that, but I'm like, no, what if the ground, unstable and gives way, or what if a gust of wind picks up and pushes me, or, I'm thinking about things that aren't happening but could, then I adjust how close I'm willing to get to the edge of the cliff to accommodate for those things, which is good. It means that I'm not going to get blown off, or, the ground won't come out from under me. Now, that might not have happened anyway, right? Like I could have gone up to the edge of the cliff and no wind comes and the ground doesn't fall, and I would have been fine. But it's safer to stay further back. So what you're talking about is, it is also true to say that if I never leave my house, I will never fall off of a cliff, because there are no cliffs in my house. So that is a strategy that you will definitely not fall from a high place and get hurt if you never leave your house. But at a certain point, and it changes depending on the person and the context and the fear, at a certain point we feel comfortable saying, like, this is too much of a cost to pay. I'm making more of a sacrifice than is necessary to achieve the safety that I'm trying to achieve. It's working. I have that safety, but I'm sacrificing a lot of things that I probably don't need to sacrifice, paying a cost that I probably don't need to pay in order, and that's when we're talking about things are disproportionate. So thinking about how it might go, including feeling momentarily how it would feel if it went that way, that's perfectly rational. Getting stuck in that to the point that then now you're spending the rest of the day as though it is true that that happened is probably usually one of those things where you're paying a higher cost than is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And we work on making that change when it's not happening, not when it is. I can keep talking. Sometimes I just keep talking so that you don't feel any pressure or nobody there feels any pressure.
Yeah, I keep wanting to say things that I don't think I would feel comfortable having on a stream, so that's why I'm getting stuck.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
There's nothing, I think this is...
I did have a Brandon moment this weekend.
Yeah. Sure, but you're whispering and people might
Sorry.
not hear you.
Sorry. I was listening to, I don't know if it's a Brandon moment, but it did remind me of you.
I'm curious to see what a Brandon moment means.
Oh my gosh, okay. I was listening to this YouTube series about, oh my gosh, so many thoughts at the same time. I was listening to this YouTube series about songwriting, and this person who hosts it or whatever, she was saying, one of the most annoying questions I get is people coming and saying to me, well, did Joni Mitchell know what that chord change was, or did she know the implications of the lyrics she was writing? And then she was talking about different ways to answer the question, and she was like, one way to answer the question is, it doesn't matter. Another way to answer the question, which was the Brandon moment, is, what do you mean by no? And then no is in knowledge, not no as in no. Just, yeah. So, and then those sorts of things, and it was interesting. She talked about how some versions of defining the word intuition is having knowledge that's so automated into an impulse in the body that the knowledge is technically there because you're doing the thing, so you know how to do it, but that it's so automatic that it's not something that you're not consciously, how do I say this? You're not saying okay, so for example, she said something about there are 130 whatever chord options on a piano, and she said the person isn't going through all 136 of them or whatever it is to determine which chord would sound like missing a lover who passed away or something, but that there's enough intuitive knowledge that it's okay, well, maybe I'll try these 5 different chords, and then feeling it and seeing which one matches whatever lyrics you're writing and whatever feeling you're trying to get across. And so I thought, I don't know, the what do you mean by no thing reminded me of Brandon, which is you are in this room with me. Hi, Brandon.
Hi. I like that, although I will say, and I don't know if this is what you said that she said, I don't know how.
Yeah.
But that she said one way to answer, if the question is how did Joni Mitchell know what chord she was playing, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And she said one way to answer that question is to say, what do you mean by no? That's not a way to answer the question, but it's a way to get you information to enable you to answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
Saying what do you mean by no does not, and just for me personally, I think it's important to clarify that, because I do often ask people what they mean by things, and people will often interpret me asking what they mean as though that's my answer to their question.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not. I'm saying I don't understand your question well enough to be able to give you an answer.
Mm-hmm.
That one possibility is okay, I can think of 2 or 3 things that you might mean by no, and depending on which thing you mean, I would answer the question differently.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's just, I have no idea.
Could that be categorized as a response then? My response to your question is what do you mean by no, but not my answer to your question is what do you mean by no?
Because the point of it is to get more information that allows you to answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, an answer to a question that's always valid is, I don't know, right? Sometimes,
I think part of why it reminded me of a Brandon moment is that I feel in the question, at least if I was playing this out, I wouldn't know how I was defining no and what I meant by no. And so then it would become a larger conversation about what is it to know something, and that would be
sometimes
useful.
It goes that way, but let's do this particular question, did Joni Mitchell know what chord she was playing? And if I said, well, what do you mean by know? And your response was like, what is it to know anything? I'd be like, okay, cool. Also, though, I mean, like, are you saying, did she know the proper, like, term? Like, did she know that the chord she was playing is called a C major seventh?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you mean, did she know it as in she is predicting how people would be impacted by it and how it would be interpreted? Like, did she know that people would hear that chord and think, oh, that's what it feels like to, I forget what you said, lose a lover or something like
That
that?
died a year ago or something.
Right. So, like, that's two examples of what someone might mean by the word know in that case that would have different, because I could say to one, like, yes, she knows that it's a C major seventh. I mean, I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't be able to answer that question. But that the answer to that question could be yes, she knew it was a C major seventh.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to the other question could be like, in fact, I would say is no, she doesn't know how it will impact people,
Mm-hmm.
but she can have a sense of how it might impact people, but
Well,
also
and then maybe a sense of how it impacts her, and thinking at least some percentage of the people listening to this, it might impact them in the same way.
right. That's what I was going to say is at the root of it, all she can know is how it's impacting her, how she's hearing it. And then, yes, she can project off of that onto other people. But I would guess, and I don't know, but I would guess that Joni Mitchell, just because I think this is like we've talked about in terms of being an artist and making art, that second step is unnecessary.
Which is the second step.
Of because it's impacting me this way, I can project that it might impact other people that way.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't need that second. You can just say, this is how it's hitting me.
Yeah.
And be done.
Yeah.
I do think that's a big part of what makes it easier for artists to create and share art is to not worry about how other people will be impacted by it, but rather to just have confidence in that I'm putting something out there and people will be impacted by it however they are. And I can't really control that because some people will hear that and think that, and some people will hear it and think something completely different. The part of the conversation about intuition, I think, is interesting, and that is one of those terms that's used to mean different things. I mean, many terms are that way, obviously, pretty much everything.
Yeah.
I think in the description you gave of that person's answer, that it sounded like she was talking about what I would think of as kind of two different things that intuition could be used to mean, and then there's some others too that I think of. But one is something that we could also use the word assumption for, which is I've done something, and then after the fact, in thinking about why I did that thing or why I had that impulse, I can then kind of extrapolate, well, maybe I had some sense that it would go this way, but it wasn't an actual experience. You didn't have an actual conscious experience of an intuitive thought or impulse or whatever. You just did a thing, and now you're in talking about what happened, saying, I think I probably had an intuition that would go that way. Another version of intuition that it sounds like she maybe wasn't talking about is that conscious experience of like, I just have this sense that something is wrong and I can't explain it, right? Which we can talk about in a second. And then the other one that it sounds like she was also talking about is guesses about what's worth trying next without being able to explain it. Like, if I want to play a chord that seems sad, here are like a few different things I can try. You just have an idea without being able to explain the idea of like, let me try this, now let me try this, right? Like narrowing down your possibilities.
Do you think that last one comes from, let's say, for example, playing the guitar enough and remembering your responses to different chords on the guitar to be like, okay.
Well, yes, but remembering is a tricky word there because
I would love to talk about memory with you because this is.
Well, sure, but that's right now I'm referring to its use in that particular statement.
Yeah.
Because are you consciously remembering what each chord made you feel like? No. Probably not. You know, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely that you're like, okay, I know that when I heard a C, it made me feel this way. But in the sense of like, when I'm just improvising and coming up with stuff in the moment, and I hit a minor chord when I'm improvising something sad, then yes, I have to have prior experience with minor chords that somehow in my brain or nervous system, whatever, got connected to the idea of sadness and connected to the movement of my skeletal muscular system in a certain way to hit those chords. And like that, piano, I actually think is a great example to talk about a lot of these things, because there are times where you can see, I think piano more so than most other instruments, you can see someone making stuff up and you can see that there's no time for thought. There's no way that there could be any conscious thought of like, I'm going to go from this chord to this chord, because it's just, you're watching the finger shapes change. This is true of all instruments. I just think it's more visible with piano that, like, you know, when someone's like, bah, 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 and they're switching to different chord shapes on the way down. It's a really like obvious example of how practicing something over and over gets it so that you can do it without thinking about it. But anyway, I think intuition is always going to be one of those two things. Like when we're using that word, it's either we're talking after the fact about something that you didn't consciously experience, and we're just saying, I think I had an intuitive sense. You know, I didn't experience it consciously, but I'm talking about why I might have done that thing that at the time, you know, like no one could have guessed rationally or reasonably that it would result the way that it did, but I did it and it resulted that way. I must have had some intuition. And then the other is that, no, I have a conscious intuitive thought of like, I'm going to try this, even though I can't explain why. And the version that she was talking about is just a specific subset, which is an intuitive idea, right? Like intuition saying, I'm going to try this thing, where other intuition can be things like, I'm picking up on something, or I have a thought or a feeling about something, even though I'm not doing something with it. So really we always get so, not always, but often get so philosophical when we don't have like other people commenting, and we don't today.
Well, that already fixes part of it.
By the time you are, we could say, having a thought, aware of a thought, by the time a thought becomes observable to you, it has already been constructed. That hypothetically,
what do you mean by constructed? And that's
that there, if the thought pops into my mind of, I want to have a sandwich, right? That the things, the data that I might have been picking up on that went into constructing that thought, right? Like there's a threshold that theoretically, hypothetically, there's a process, because I want to have a sandwich doesn't just arrive out of nowhere. Theoretically, there's information I'm taking in and whatever. There are processes that are constructing that thought. And there's a threshold that in that process at a certain point, I'm now conscious of the thought. In philosophy, we call these cognates, the like base building block thought, that you can't break it down any further than that. That's like the base level thought.
And is I want a sandwich, that's not a cognate, right?
You could, I mean, it's all this stuff is, there's blurry edges. You can make people define it different ways, but one common way of breaking down the different cognates is that there's three kinds. There's affect, which is I feel something. There's cognition, which is I think something. And there's volition, which is I have an impulse, I want something, you know. And so I want a sandwich, you could say that's a volition, you know, that we can break it down further than that only in theory, right? We can, after the fact, we can say, well, you were probably hungry and you've had prior experiences of eating sandwiches that you enjoy, and you're aware of the fact that you have the, you know, ingredients to be able to make a sandwich, and know, you know, all these things that must be true. But in terms of like tracing the thought back, you did not observe yourself thinking or feeling any of those things.
Unless the person would be able to say consciously, oh, I thought I'm hungry.
Right.
And then I thought
that's why
I
it's
want
all
a
blurry
sandwich.
edges, because sometimes I might think I am hungry. Oh, I have stuff to make a sandwich. Then I arrive at I want a sandwich. But sometimes you just have the thought without any of the other stuff that you notice. You just, the first thing you notice is I want a sandwich.
Mm-hmm.
Or a more like applicable example when we're talking about intuition is I'm scared. That's an affect cognitive, a thing I feel. I'm scared. And theoretically, we could say, what are some of the things that you're picking up on, after the fact? We can theorize about what are some of the things that you're picking up on. Why would why would those things influence other things to arrive at just a sense of fear?
Mm-hmm.
But in the moment, your first experience of anything there is just fear. I'm scared. So that's what we mean, there's narratives we can construct after the fact, but the actual experience of it, that's the first thought you have. And so intuition, I think, is a way of talking about those thoughts that we can't, even after the fact, we have a hard time breaking down in a way that sounds reasonable to people.
Would an example be I'm on a tropical vacation and I'm laying on the beach and it's a perfect day and I thought I'm terrified?
Sure.
Because you wouldn't be able to go back and analyze the situation and think, oh yeah, I was terrified because
Right,
I was in the middle of a forest and a grizzly bear was nearby.
Well, sure. And of course, even in that scenario, we could say things like, well, you're isolated from things that you're normally, you always theoretically could come up with analysis. And this is a lot of what, when therapy is doing analysis, this is a lot of what it's doing is constructing narratives. Someone has a thought, a feeling, or engages in some behavior that didn't go well or wasn't enjoyable, and they don't understand why, and they can't explain it in rational terms. And then in therapy, the therapist and the client work together and come up with a narrative of why it would make sense.
And is the counterbalance to that, okay, this is how you feel now, let's experiment to try to help you feel better?
Potentially, it depends, right? Because sometimes the conclusion because these narratives, they're made up. It doesn't mean they're inaccurate. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean they're not useful, but they are just stories we're making up after the fact. Mm-hmm. And so depending on the analysis, we might come to the conclusion of no, it makes sense that you felt that way and you shouldn't try to change it. You should just stop thinking you're weird or bad for having felt that. Mm-hmm. Because it made sense. Another conclusion you can come to is yep, no, that made no sense and it wasn't helpful to you and it wasn't pleasant. So let's look at how we can make changes so that it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. Or let's look at what we can do so that when it happens, you're able to get out of it more quickly. Mm-hmm. Because the thing about intuition is it doesn't have to be accurate, right? There are times we all have these things of I just have a sense that something terrible is going to happen today, and then nothing terrible happens. That doesn't mean you didn't have that intuition. It just means that your intuition didn't reflect what actually happened. But that's true of all thoughts of the future.
Could you say that if someone had an intuition that something terrible is going to happen, and then later that day something terrible happened, that the intuition is still not inherently accurate? It just was able to be mapped onto reality?
Well, so accuracy is not a binary thing. That's why I use the term accurate instead of correct or true. Mm-hmm. Because if we were talking about a binary thing that it was correct, well, if I had a sense something terrible would happen and then something happened, which we can all agree can be defined as something terrible, mm-hmm. then it was true, it was correct. Mm-hmm. But in terms of accuracy, if I step on a scale and it says 238 pounds, that could be accurate. And if I step on a different scale and it says 238.7 pounds, that's also accurate, but even more accurate. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So a sense that something terrible would happen and then something happens that we can all agree is something terrible, that's accurate. But a sense that someone I know is going to get in a bad car accident and then that happens, we would say is even more accurate, mm-hmm. because it's more precise. Mm-hmm. So accuracy is not a binary thing. And not all intuition is about predicting the future, but we're talking about the ones that are. And then also perception checking gets involved, because if I'm expecting something bad to happen, if I have a sense that something bad is going to happen, then theoretically I am being more vigilant and looking at, paying more attention to things that could go badly, mm-hmm. and therefore might notice some things that go badly that theoretically I might not otherwise have noticed.
Is that the cognitive miser?
No, but it's an effect of the fact that we spend resources the way that we do.
Yeah.
But yeah, no,
That's fascinating. I guess an example I can think of is knowing people in my life who are relatively chill and could go through the same day. I guess this isn't possible. Go ahead and challenge me, Brandon, but could go through the exact same day that I go through, and because I am so focused on what is going wrong, that I notice the things that are going wrong as though I had a bad day, and that exact same person could say, "Oh, it was a good day," because they noticed the things that were going well.
Well-
And that although both are accurate, maybe to the same degree ish. I don't know. I'm getting lost.
That's hypothetically true but untestable, right? Because you
Yeah.
can't actually have two different people have the
Mhm.
exact same day and see what happens. What we can do though is have two different people like side by side observing something
Mhm.
and see what they each remember walking away or how they each feel. And we have a lot of evidence that
Mhm.
two different people can experience the same thing and feel very differently about it or remember it very differently.
Mhm.
So that's why it's hypothetically true.
Would
that
an
someone
example
is-
of that be like you have two people look at a painting of a forest and they purposefully put in like a devilish figure that's harder to see, and then they purposefully put in like an angelic figure that's harder to see, and one person said, "Oh, that looks like a really enchanted forest, there's an angel," and then the other person says, "That looks like a haunting forest, there's a devil." Would that be like an example? That's what I picture.
I mean, that's an example of two people observing the same thing and coming, feeling differently about it, remembering it
Mhm.
differently, noticing different elements. Yes.
But were you also referring to like you and I right now in the stream, for example?
What about it?
That we are observing the same thing, because we're not observing the same thing.
No.
Okay.
Well, our observations are not the same because I'm in my position and you're in your position. But like, if we were to say,
How many
for
things-
practical purposes, like, what about that pillow? Even though we're seeing literal different angles of it,
Mhm.
for practical purposes, we can say, yeah, we're both, or that picture.
Mhm.
We have different angles of it, but we're seeing the
More or
same
less.
data more or less for
Yeah.
practical purposes.
Mhm.
And what we're talking about in your scenario would be kind of like if there is a painting of a forest with a like hidden angel figure and a hidden devil figure or whatever, and we send people in to look at that with different priming them differently. Meaning if we send somebody in there saying like, hey, there's a hidden devil, that person's more likely to find it than if we send somebody in there saying there's a hidden angel. Or if we send someone in at all saying there are hidden figures, where someone else we don't say there are hidden figures, one person might walk away being like, yeah, there's a picture of a forest, and the other person says, I found the hidden figures.
Mhm.
So expectations very much, yes, dictate like what we're looking out for and correlate with what we end up noticing and how we feel and how we behave. That's the point of, that's why work can be done in between when the thing isn't happening, but before it happens, we can do things that make it so that when it happens, it's different
Mhm.
by changing the expectations, changing what things we are looking to observe, and how we interpret and respond to those things. Right? If I send someone in saying there's a hidden figure versus there's a hidden mythological figure versus there's a hidden devil, like what they remember will be different. But even without that specific prompt, if two people look at a painting of a forest and one of them is very knowledgeable about the different tree species and whatever, and one of them isn't, then after the fact, if we say like, how many trees did you see? The one that's more knowledgeable about the tree species is more likely to say like, well, I saw 5 different varieties. And the other one's like, I don't know, I saw a bunch of trees. This is why language matters so much.
Do you think then the person who is knowledgeable about trees would be less likely to notice details about other aspects of the painting because they're predisposed to notice the type of tree?
Not necessarily
Because it's
in
finite?
this case.
Okay.
So, because there we're talking about a knowledge base and some skill,
Mm-hmm.
which those are things that can actually, in other words, that person is likely, if we're talking, not measurable, but theoretically that person is taking in less specific information about each individual tree
Mhm.
because they're just taking in enough information about that tree to identify it as a birch.
Mhm.
Now, if another person just takes in enough information to identify it as a tree, that could be the same amount of information, that they picked up the same
Oh, that
information
makes a lot
but
of
matches
sense.
against tree versus
Yeah.
birch. It
Mhm.
could be that the person who's reading it as tree picks up less because I need less information to identify it as a tree than as a birch.
Yeah.
Or it could be more.
Mhm.
It could be that I'm picking up more information than the person identifying it as a birch in order to identify it as a tree, especially if it's novel,
Yeah.
or especially if I'm trying to figure out what kind of tree it is. I want some other label to apply to it, and I'm looking at all this data to try and get markers that help me label it, but I can't.
Mhm.
So no, not necessarily.
Interesting.
But if we were saying it kind of taking away the like knowledge-based part, if we say
Mhm.
one person we send in saying there are hidden figures and one person we say it's just a painting, go look at it, then yes, the person who's looking for the hidden figures is going to be scanning. Like when people spend time like in the wilderness or whatever and want to get better at spotting animals, a thing that I'm making some assumptions here. A thing I was taught, I assume that it's commonly taught, is that you look for unusual shapes, breaks in patterns, right?
Mhm.
That like,
If it's not a leaf, it's not a branch, it's not. Is that what you mean?
well, that like if all the branches on this tree have this general flow to them and then this one branch seems to be sticking out at a different angle, then maybe that's not a branch. Or the most common example that everyone would know is movement, right? That if you're looking at a field and then all of a sudden something moves, that's a break in the pattern that draws your attention. And so the more you know and are able to identify the patterns, the more you're able to identify breaks in the pattern and whatever.
Mhm.
But that would be an example of like, I'm not so much looking at the tree, I'm looking for elements of the tree that don't seem to match with the rest of it, which is a specific subset of it.
Mhm.
So yes, there's cost, opportunity cost is what we're talking about here, that if I'm paying more attention to one thing, that's attention I'm not paying to something else.
Mhm.
But there's also frameworks which make it so that I don't need to pay as much attention to one thing in order to draw the useful conclusion, because I have more information to be able to identify things quickly and easily. But the whole accuracy is not being binary thing. Like I can say this is a fidget, which is accurate. I could say these are specks, and that's accurate. I could say they are small metallic magnetic balls that stick together.
Rare earth magnets.
Whatever that means. I don't know what that means.
That's what they say on the packaging.
Right, which sounds cool, but
it sounds really cool.
It's kind of like I haven't watched this show, but there's a famous scene in Mad Men where the like advertising executive back in the 60s or whatever it is says, we're going to start talking about how our filtered taste. These cigarettes have a smooth filtered taste, and the client is saying like, all cigarettes are filtered, they're required to be filtered. And he says, yes, but by emphasizing the fact that ours is filtered, we imply that other people's aren't without having to say that.
Ugh.
And so then everybody either has to say theirs is filtered too, and now everyone thinks of them as a copycat, or allow people to think of them as not being filtered or whatever. The language that we use, it dictates, so rare earth, I have no idea. It is entirely possible, as far as I know, that all magnets are rare earth magnets.
Mhm.
I have no idea. I assume that's not the case because they're emphasizing it, which makes me think that it's not true of all, but that's an example of a phrase that carries no meaning to me.
Mhm.
It still impacts me.
Mhm.
It has a kind of like when you're looking at a menu at a restaurant and you read like the description of the food item and it contains, it uses words for things that like you don't know what those things are, and that impacts, ooh, this is fancy, or it's not whatever.
Mhm.
The joke of everyone saying like aioli is just mayonnaise, but if you call it aioli, language, the language you use, the symbols you use, dictates things. So yes, perception checking, the idea that if I'm angry, I'm going to then say, why am I angry? right? If I'm feeling angry but have no conscious awareness of what it is that's making me angry or why I'm angry, then my next response, if I've already identified it as anger, is going to be, what am I angry about? Could it be this? No. Could it be this? No. Could it be this? Yes, that thing does make me angry. And the fact that you didn't have the thought until after the anger kind of gets lost, and people just say, I'm angry because of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're feeling angry, you're more likely to notice stuff that justifies your anger. When you're feeling excited, you're more likely to notice things that justify your excitement. But yes, those are all, you were saying, if two different people had the same day and had different experiences, they're both accurate. Yes. If you say, hey, hand me those specs, that's accurate. If I say, hey, hand me the fidget, that's accurate too. Language, I don't know. This stuff to me is,
I think I'm starting to get it. I was doing it with a client earlier today, and I think it was great.
cool. Well, we have had an hour-long stream that did not feel like it was an hour. I legit feel like we were just talking for 10 or 15 minutes, but it's been
Does that
more.
mean you enjoyed it?
I
You
did
say that
enjoy it.
often.
I don't know if that means that I enjoyed it, but I did enjoy it.
I thought you said at one point that like when people are enjoying their lives, they're more likely to think that less time has passed than it really has.
Maybe I said that. That's a common phrase. Time flies when you're having fun. But also, time can fly in a miserable experience too. It's not about how enjoyable it is. It's about how much of your attention is available to notice markers of the passage of time. If something is taking all of your attention and therefore you don't notice your growing hunger or fatigue or the changing light outside or the clock moving or whatever, then you're less likely to, you'll feel the passage of time less.
So we're just all like time warpers, especially you and Amy. I mean that in a very good way.
Yeah, maybe.
Like the distribution of attention and
something
you just need someone walking around saying, Brandon, you're hungry. I'd be like, oh yeah, I am hungry.
I actually thought, maybe it was last week, I don't remember. I had a thought recently about this and specifically about sharing it with you that I don't know if you know these terms, and that's why I was going to put them out to you. Chronos and Kairos.
Yeah, we talked about it before.
Yeah, for the stream, those are two different words used to describe time in like ancient Greek. And Chronos is about what we mostly talk about time, like the past, like the measurable passage of time, and Kairos is like the experience of the passage of time that shifts. They're two different things. Anyway, this was fun. I had fun anyway.
I'm pretty Kairos.
I don't think it's a
it's all fractal.
but I'm not actually sure. I think it's a noun though.
Yeah.
Anyway, this was fun.
I'm grateful for you, Brandon. Brandon Bridge Tessers. That's your new name for me.
Thank you all who are here or are watching this in the future.
Watching
Good to be with you. We'll be
in the bendable future.
We will be here next Monday, same time. 1 p.m.
I might not be
time.
here the whole time because of the eclipse.
Yeah, we'll end in time to be able to see the solar eclipse, which I think is
the partial eclipse.
1:50. We'll end at the 50-minute mark or something.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be 2:05, but then it's like I don't know, setting up.
We'll be here at 1 o'clock.
We'll be here
Central
at 1
time,
o'clock
p.m.
But maybe not for an hour.
Good to be with you all, and
now you do the good thing. Bye.